So we're going to look at factoring quadratics. Now, x squared plus 6x plus 8, we want to factor that so that it's going to be a product of two binomials. Now, we know that this would have to be x and x, so that when I multiplied that out, x times x, I would get x squared. Okay, we also know that the two numbers in the second spots have to multiply to 8. So I could put 1 and 8 here. That could be it, because we do know that 1 times 8 will get us the 8. However, it could also be x plus 2 times x plus 4. Because in this case 2 times 4 also gets us the 8 that we're looking for. Okay, both of these two things will work for our x squared and our plus 8, but which one of these is actually going to get us the 6x in the middle? And so you need to think about how multiplying the rest of the binomials out will get you that middle term. So x times this 8 would get me 8x, and 1 times this x will get me 1x, which gets me 9x for my middle term, and that's not correct. It's supposed to be 6x. So I look down here on the bottom one, this x times this 4 that I put here would get me 4x, this 2 times this x would get me 2x, and in fact when I add those I do get that 6x in the middle term. And so this second one is the way that I would factor that top quadratic. And you have to do that when you're doing a quadratic. You kind of have to think through all the possibilities of what it could be. So once you factor the quadratic, if this is a quadratic equation equals 0 and we factor it, what we're looking at here is two things that are multiplied to equal 0. If two things are multiplied to equal 0, if I go way up here and say a times b equals 0, the only way I can multiply two things to equaling 0 is if one of them is 0. There's no other numbers I can choose for a and b to multiply to 0. So either a is 0 or b is 0. One of those has to be true, otherwise they will not multiply to 0. So if we think of these things down here as kind of like a and b, I'm multiplying these two things together to get 0. Either one of those has to be 0. Either x plus 2 has to equal 0, or x plus 4 has to equal 0. So you can see by looking at that, you can do the algebra to subtract 2 from both sides and 4 from both sides on this one, or you can just kind of look at this and say, hey, if x was negative 2, that would be 0, and so x equals negative 2, or in this case x equals negative 4. So that's my solution to this quadratic equation right here, and to how we solved it by factoring. Okay, we factored this into two binomials. Okay, let's look over on the right at x squared plus 5x minus 14. Same kind of things going on over here. We're going to factor this into a product of two binomials. We know this has to be x and x, and we know that the two numbers I put in the other two spots have to multiply to negative 14. So sometimes we like to just put a list of what those are. So we could do negative 2 times 7, or 2 times negative 7, or 1 times negative 14, or negative 1 times positive 14. And we have all those options that we're going to put up into these spots. So there's 4 different possibilities, where on that last problem there were only 2. So if I'm looking at all these 4 possibilities, I know that when I put them there, I'm going to multiply by x. So whatever I put in this spot right here, x is going to get multiplied by it, and it's going to be, say if it's negative 2 in that spot, then it would be negative 2x. And whatever gets put in this spot is going to be multiplied by this x. And then those terms are going to be added together to form this middle term. So if I add negative 2 plus 7, I get 5. If I add 2 and negative 7, I get negative 5. If I add 1 and negative 14, I get negative 13. and positive 13. And so I can look through those and see which ones are going to add to that middle term of 5x. And so we found it right here. So the answer must be x minus 2 plus 7 for how to factor that. So now that we have it factored, we'd want to look at this and say I have now two things that multiply to 0. The x values that will make that happen are the x values that make each separate side of this equal to 0. So we want to look at when x minus 2 equals 0 or when x plus 7 equals 0. Well, this happens, x minus 2 is equal to 0 when x equals 2, and x plus 7 equals 0 when x equals negative 7. And so our solutions to that quadratic equation are 2 and negative 7. Okay, let's take a look at a couple more. With this one, x squared minus 8x plus 12, it's kind of a little different because they multiply to a positive and they add to a negative here. It's kind of weird. But still, when I factor these, it's going to have to factor a little bit like that. Why? Well, because x times x is x squared. My other two numbers have to multiply to 12. Now, we were talking about then adding them to get this thing, and since they add to a negative 8, they're going to have to be negative numbers. They're going to both have to be negative numbers, because in order to multiply to positive 12, it's going to have to be a negative times a negative. A negative times a negative is a positive. So what two numbers multiply to 12 and add to negative 8? Well, we got negative 2 and negative 6, negative 1 and negative 12, or negative 3 and negative 4. Those are all of our possibilities. And so we look at those and say which ones of these would add to this negative 8 in the middle, and I can see that it's going to be this first one. And so I know that this is x minus 2 times x minus 6. Again, the whole reason that we're factoring a quadratic is so we can get this split up into two things that are multiplied equaling 0. Because I know that if two things multiplied equals 0, one of them has to be 0 to make that happen. So either x minus 2 has to be 0 or x minus 6 has to be equal to 0. This happens when x equals 2, and this one happens when x equals 6. And so my solutions to that quadratic equation are 2 and 6. Okay, so I think it's reasonable to ask this last question because they don't always come in a really nice, pretty setup way. Sometimes they look kind of strange, like the one on the right. The first thing you want to do if you have a quadratic equation is, you see this x squared quadratic equation, is make sure it says equals 0 like over here and like on the previous problems. So I need to take this and I need to add 5x to both sides. That's going to leave me with x squared plus 5x equals, now this is going to add to 0, and so I'm left with minus 6 over here. And then I need to add 6 to both sides, and I'll have x squared plus 5x plus 6 equals 0. Okay, now to factor that, I'm going to look at this and say, well, to get x squared, I have to have an x on the first binomial and an x on the second binomial. I know my two numbers here have to multiply to 6. Well, that could be 1 times 6, but 1 and 6 add to 7, not 5. Well, 2 times 3 is 6, so this could be plus 2 and plus 3. Okay, that works because I have 2x when I multiply here and 3x when I multiply there, which add to 5x in the middle. Okay, so the whole point was that these two things are multiplying now to 0, and that can only happen if one of them is 0. So I want to look at when either x plus 2 equals 0 or when x plus 3 equals 0. So my solutions then are going to be x equals negative 2 and negative 3. And that's how you factor quadratics.